It was past midnight when the door chimed, and the air in the diner changed. Not like a gust of wind or a sudden drop in temperature, but like the world had stopped breathing for just a second, as if the universe itself leaned forward to see who had walked in. The night was slow, the kind of slow that makes you hear the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of the refrigerator in the back. And I was halfway through wiping down the counter when I looked up and saw him. Tall, sharply dressed in a dark suit that didn't belong anywhere near this side of town, his expression unreadable, his movements deliberate, like every step was calculated, measured, dangerous. Behind him came 3 other men, all broad-shouldered and silent, their eyes scanning every corner of the diner like they were mapping exits and threats. But it wasn't them that made my stomach twist and my hands go cold. It was him. The man who walked in last, but somehow took up the most space. I'd seen men like him before, not in real life, but in headlines, in whispers, in the kind of stories people told when they thought no one was listening. The ones who lived in shadows but controlled everything the light touched. Men who didn't ask for things. They took them. And as he crossed the threshold, his eyes met mine for half a second, and I felt the kind of fear that has teeth. I told myself to look away, to keep my head down like every other waitress who wanted to make it through another night, another shift, another rent payment. But there was something about the way he looked at me. Not curious, not kind, but piercing, like he was peeling back my skin and looking for something underneath. 4 coffees, one of the men said gruffly, his voice low but commanding. Black. I nodded, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach my eyes, turning toward the coffee machine as if the simple act of pouring caffeine could steady the trembling in my chest. My hands shook slightly, and I prayed he wouldn't notice. But he did. He noticed everything. I felt it, his gaze following every small movement, the way his head tilted just slightly as if he was studying me. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind that makes the walls feel closer and the air thicker, and even the music from the old jukebox seemed to die mid-song, leaving only the sound of my heart pounding against my ribs. Busy night? He asked, his voice smooth, deep, and calm in a way that made it worse, because it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a test. Not really, I managed, setting down the cups in front of them, keeping my tone light, casual, invisible. Just you guys now. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. His eyes, cold gray, sharp enough to cut through anything soft, shifted briefly toward the back booth where I'd left Leo's stroller tucked in the shadows. And that was when my pulse stopped. I had made sure he was out of sight, asleep, hidden, under the soft blanket my sister had given me before she left for Arizona. I never brought him here, not during the night shifts. But tonight, the babysitter had canceled, and I needed the money, and the owner didn't care as long as I kept my tables clean and my customers happy. But when that man, that stranger, looked at the stroller, his expression changed. Just slightly. Barely enough for anyone else to notice. But I saw it. A flicker of something that wasn't indifference, wasn't curiosity, but recognition. Like he was staring at something that shouldn't exist. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep moving, to clear the counter, to pretend I hadn't noticed the sudden shift in his breathing or the way his jaw clenched. Cute kid, one of his men muttered casually, nodding toward the stroller. My blood ran cold. Yeah, I said quickly, trying to sound normal, calm, human. He's mine. The man gave a small smile and went back to his coffee, but the stranger didn't. His gaze lingered, heavy, thoughtful, burning holes into me. He leaned back in his booth, his hand resting casually on the table, but his eyes stayed on Leo. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned away, walking toward the kitchen just to breathe, just to put a wall between me and whatever was happening out there. My chest ached from holding in the panic, and I pressed my hands against the cold metal counter, whispering under my breath, "Don't do this, Arya. Don't fall apart." When I came back out, they were still there, untouched cups of coffee cooling in front of them, the air so thick with tension it could be cut with a knife. He looked up at me then, and there was something different in his expression now, something calculating. "What's his name?" he asked softly. For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat closed up, my mind racing for an excuse, a lie, anything. "Leo?" I said finally, the word barely leaving my lips. "Leo," he repeated, rolling it over like he was tasting it, his eyes flicking toward the stroller again. "How old?" 8 months. Silence. Long and suffocating. His men exchanged glances like they could feel the strange current passing between us. Then he smiled. Slow, deliberate, cold. "You look familiar," he said. I forced a laugh. "I get that a lot." He didn't laugh back. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a wad of cash, and placed it on the table. "Keep the change," he said, standing. I tried not to look at the money, but the stack was too thick, too deliberate. A few hundred, maybe more. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't move. He paused by the door, his hand on the handle, then turned slightly, his voice low and smooth as smoke. "You might want to be careful who you let see your kid at night," he said. "Some men notice things they shouldn't." And with that, he was gone. The door chimed again, the cold air rushed in, and the world started, breathing once more. But I didn't move. I stood there, staring at the empty booth, at the untouched coffee, at the money glinting under the harsh diner lights. My hands trembled as I reached for the stack, and that's when I saw it. A small white business card tucked neatly under the cash, embossed with silver letters that shimmered faintly under the light. Dante Moretti. My stomach dropped. The name was familiar. Too familiar. One I'd heard whispered by men who carried guns under their jackets, and by women who disappeared when they spoke it too loudly. I looked toward the stroller, my son still asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully, oblivious to the storm that had just walked through our door. And for the first time in 8 months, I felt the past clawing its way back into my life. Because there was only one man in this city with eyes like that. And once, long ago, on a night I swore I'd never think about again, those eyes had looked down at me from a hotel bed, full of fire and sin and something that almost felt like love. Now he was back. And he'd just seen the child who looked exactly like him. When I finally got home that night, the air felt heavy, like even the walls were watching me, listening to the echo of my heartbeat. And though I locked every door and pulled every curtain closed, I couldn't shut out the feeling that something, or someone, had followed me home. The baby monitor hummed softly beside me, Leo's gentle breathing filling the quiet, and I stared at that little white card on the counter as if it were a loaded weapon. Because in a way, it was. Dante Moretti. The name alone was enough to make my stomach twist, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was carved into the deepest parts of my memory, the parts I'd tried to bury under years of exhaustion and fear and survival. And yet, there it was, glowing under the dim kitchen light, a ghost resurrected in ink and paper. I told myself I should tear it up, burn it, throw it away before it could poison my life again, but my hand froze midair because I couldn't do it. Not yet. Not before I remembered. And once the remembering began, there was no stopping it. Like the tide pulling you under no matter how hard you fight to stay afloat. It was 2 years ago, though it feels like another lifetime now. I was 23, broke and stupidly hopeful, still believing that life would reward me for being good, for working hard, for keeping my head down. I was an art student by day, a server by night. And when my classmate told me about a private party looking for extra help at a luxury hotel downtown, I said yes, without thinking twice. That night I wore a black dress the event manager handed me, a size too small and cut too low. But I didn't argue, because $50 an hour meant groceries and bus fare, and maybe even a little rent cushion. The ballroom sparkled like a dream. Chandeliers dripping light onto gold-rimmed glasses and velvet curtains, and every man there looked like he could buy a country just to burn it down for fun. I remember the way I balanced a tray of champagne flutes in my trembling hands, trying not to stare at the guests. But then I looked up and saw him. Dante. He was standing near the balcony, talking to another man, his head tilted slightly as he listened, his expression calm but dangerous in that quiet, controlled way that draws you in before you realize you're already trapped. There was something magnetic about him, something cold and beautiful and completely out of reach, like staring at a storm from the edge of a cliff and knowing it could swallow you whole if you took one step closer. He looked up once, just once, and our eyes met. And that was it. The world narrowed to that single moment, the weight of his gaze, the faint curve of his mouth, the unspoken question in his eyes that made me forget how to breathe. I looked away first, pretending to busy myself with refilling glasses, but I could feel him watching me, could feel that invisible thread that formed between us, thin and dangerous as a blade. Later, after the party had thinned out and the music softened, I went out onto the terrace just to catch my breath. The night was warm, the city humming below, and I remember thinking how beautiful it all looked from up there, how easy it was to believe you were untouchable when the world glittered beneath you. Then he spoke behind me. "You don't belong here." I turned, startled, nearly spilling the tray I was carrying, and there he was, standing under the glow of the city lights, his tie loosened, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes locked on me like I was the most interesting secret in the room. "I'm working," I said, my voice too soft, too nervous. He smiled then, slow and knowing. That's not what I meant. Something in the way he said it made my pulse race, and though I should have walked away, should have remembered every rule about staying invisible, I didn't. Because there was something about him, something dangerous and intoxicating, that made me want to know what it felt like to stop running for once. We talked. Or maybe it was more like I answered and he observed. His voice was smooth, deliberate, each word measured like a promise and a warning all at once. He asked about my art, my dreams, the reason I worked so many jobs, and I told him things I hadn't told anyone, not realizing until much later that I was already giving him pieces of myself I'd never get back. When the event ended, he offered to walk me out. I said yes. The hallway was empty, the sound of our footsteps echoing against the marble, and when we reached the elevator, he didn't press the button. He just looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable, and I should have said goodnight. I should have walked away. But instead I stood there waiting for something I couldn't name. "Tell me to stop," he said quietly, his voice low, enough that it barely existed between us. I didn't. And when he kissed me, it wasn't soft or sweet. It was hungry, desperate, like he'd been starving for years and just found something worth breaking his rules for. His hands were warm and certain, his mouth demanding, and the world blurred until there was nothing left but him and the way he made me feel like I was both burning and being remade. The night that followed was a blur of heat and breath and whispered names in the dark. The kind of night that felt like it couldn't possibly exist in the same world where I scraped tips and counted quarters for bus fare. I remember the way he said my name, slow and deliberate, like he was tasting it, like he meant it. But morning came too fast, and when I woke, the bed beside me was empty. No note, no number. Nothing but the faint trace of cologne on the sheets. I told myself it was better that way, that whatever had happened between us belonged to the dark and the silence, and the version of me that didn't have to think about consequences. But weeks later, when the nausea started and my body changed, the truth hit me like a freight train. I hadn't just left that night behind. I'd brought a piece of it with me. I never tried to find him. I couldn't. Because when I found out who he really was, Dante Moretti, the man whose name made entire rooms go quiet, I realized that crossing his path again would mean risking more than my heart. It would mean risking my life. So I disappeared. I dropped out of school, moved across town, changed my number, changed everything. And for 8 months, it worked. I built a fragile little world out of routine and exhaustion and late-night diner shifts. I told myself he would never know. He would never find me. Until tonight. Until he walked into that diner like fate had finally caught up to me and looked at my son, the son I'd sworn I'd protect from the darkness that created him, and saw himself staring back. Now, sitting in the dim kitchen, that card gleaming under the light, I realized something far worse than fear had settled inside me. Curiosity. Because a part of me, the part I hated most, wanted to know what he would do now that he knew. Would he come for me? Would he try to take Leo? Would he destroy the fragile peace I'd built? Or would he remember that night too and wonder what it meant? The phone buzzed on the counter, and my blood ran cold when I saw the message. Unknown number. We need to talk. My hand trembled as I read the next line. Unknown number. Tomorrow. 9 p.m. The diner. Don't make me come to you. The next night came like a slow bleed through the day, each hour dragging itself across my nerves until I could taste the tension in the back of my throat, a coppery flavor of dread and anticipation that made every breath feel heavier than the last. I tried to go about my routine as if nothing had changed, as if the message on my phone hadn't been sitting in my mind like a ticking bomb, but every small sound, the clink of a spoon, the soft cry of Leo stirring in his crib, the distant hum of traffic, felt amplified, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. I told myself I wouldn't go, that I'd ignore it, throw my phone away, take Leo, and disappear again the way I had before. But deep down, in that hidden place where fear and longing blur together into something unholy, I knew I would go. Because if I didn't face him, he would find me. And if Dante Moretti wanted to find you, there wasn't a place in the world where you could hide. So I worked my shift like every other night, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. Every time the door chimed, I looked up too quickly, expecting to see him standing there, his eyes cutting through the dim light like a blade. But he didn't come. Not at first. The hours passed in a strange kind of slow motion, the diner half empty, the world muted except for the quiet buzz of neon outside the window. It was just past 9 when the door opened. This time, he didn't come with an entourage. No bodyguards, no shadows. Just him. Alone. And somehow that made it worse, because when a man like Dante Moretti walks into a place alone, it's not because he's unprotected, it's because he's the most dangerous thing in the room. He wore black again, of course. A tailored suit that looked soft enough to bleed into the dark. A loosened tie. The top buttons of his shirt undone like he'd just come from somewhere expensive and chaotic. Carrying the scent of smoke and whiskey and something that made the air in the diner taste different. He looked at me once and I forgot how to breathe. Aria. Just my name. Nothing more. But the way he said it, low, deliberate, wrapped in memory and command, made my stomach twist because no one had said my name like that since that night 2 years ago. I tried to speak, but my voice betrayed me. So I just nodded toward the back booth where no one could hear us, where the dim light couldn't expose the fear I was trying to hide. He followed without a word, moving like a shadow that had decided to take human form, and when he sat across from me, I felt like the diner had shrunk to the size of a heartbeat. He didn't start with small talk. Men like him never did. I know he's mine, he said quietly, eyes locked on mine, not angry, not pleading, just certain, like he was stating a fact written into the universe. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my pulse racing loud enough that I swore he could hear it. You don't know anything, I said, though even I could hear the lie in my voice. His lips curved slightly, not into a smile but into something darker, a small acknowledgement that I was lying, that he could smell it like blood in the water. I've seen the boy, he murmured. Same eyes, same mouth. The way he clenches his fist when he dreams, just like I used to when I was a child. You think I wouldn't recognize myself? I wanted to deny it again, to tell him he was mistaken, that he was imagining things, but the words caught in my chest and died there, because there was no point. Leo was his mirror, small and innocent and completely unaware that the man sitting across from me was the reason he existed. I looked down at my hands, twisting a napkin between my fingers until it shredded, and whispered, I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this. Dante leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his voice calm but edged with steel. What exactly didn't you want, Arya? The night we shared, or the consequences that came from pretending it didn't mean anything? My head snapped up, anger flaring even through the fear. You think that night meant something to you? You disappeared before the sun came up, Dante. You didn't even look back. For the first time, something flickered across his face, something almost human, though it vanished as quickly as it came. You left too, he said softly. You didn't exactly leave a note either. The air between us thickened, filled with everything we weren't saying. Finally, I whispered, I didn't know who you were then. If I had, you would have run sooner, he interrupted, voice low, dangerous. Yes. He leaned back, studying me like a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve, his eyes glinting under the dull fluorescent light. You did a good job hiding, he said after a pause. I have men who can find anyone. But you, he tilted his head, almost admiringly. You vanished. I almost believed you didn't exist. I wish I didn't, I said quietly. His mouth curved into that half-smile again, the one that wasn't really a smile at all. But you do. And so does my son. The word son hit me like a physical blow, pulling the air from my lungs. He reached into his jacket then, and my heart stopped until I realized it wasn't a weapon. Just a checkbook. He slid it across the table, the faint scratch of pen on paper filling the silence as he wrote a number that made my stomach drop. He tore the check and pushed it toward me. That's for you, he said. For the months you raised him alone. I'll make sure you never have to work another night shift again. I stared at the check, the number too large to even process, the ink still wet and gleaming. I don't want your money, I said, though my voice wavered. I just want you to leave us alone. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. You think this is about money? You think I can just walk away from my own blood? He leaned forward again, his voice soft but cutting. No, Arya. You made a decision when you kept him from me. Now I get to make mine. Fear spread through me like poison, because the way he said it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. What do you want? I whispered. His gaze softened just slightly, and that was somehow worse, because it made him look human again. Made me remember the man who'd whispered my name against my skin once upon a time. I want to know him, he said. I want to know you again. I want my family. Family. The word burned. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. You don't know what that means, Dante. You live in a world where people disappear, where blood is currency. You think I'll let my child grow up around that? He was silent for a long moment, his eyes dark, unreadable. Then he said softly, I don't ask permission, Arya. Something cold and final settled in my chest. He stood then, straightening his jacket, sliding the check back toward me. "Keep it," he said. "You'll need it." I looked up, trembling, my voice breaking. "If you come near him—" He cut me off with a quiet, deliberate smile. "I already have." The words hit harder than a gunshot. My breath caught, panic flooding through me as I realized what he meant. Leo. Before I could speak, Dante slipped a folded piece of paper onto the table. A photograph. My heart stopped when I saw it. Leo, in his stroller outside the diner, taken from a distance, from earlier that day. He was already watching. He'd already found us. And as he turned and walked out into the night, leaving the door swinging behind him, I knew one terrible, irreversible truth. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the war I'd spent 2 years running from. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute, because every time I closed my eyes I saw that photograph, the one Dante had left on the table like a silent warning, like a promise that he could reach into my life whenever he wanted and take whatever he pleased. I sat on the edge of my bed, the city lights leaking through the thin curtains, painting ghostly patterns on the walls, and listened to Leo's soft breathing from the crib beside me, trying to convince myself that we were still safe, that he wouldn't actually do it, that Dante Moretti, no matter how dangerous, had enough of a soul to leave a sleeping baby untouched. But the longer the night dragged on, the more I understood that I was lying to myself, that men like Dante didn't believe in boundaries or mercy or reason, that the only thing more terrifying than his anger was his sense of ownership, and in his mind, I had stolen something that belonged to him. When the morning finally came, it brought no relief, just a gray, heavy silence that felt like the pause before a storm. I moved through the apartment on autopilot, feeding Leo, changing him, forcing myself to hum a lullaby I barely remembered, my voice trembling on every note. I tried to act normal, because that's what fear teaches you. To pretend, to perform, to move as though everything is fine so that the world doesn't smell your terror. Around noon, I called the diner and told them I couldn't come in that night, that I was sick, that I needed one day, just one, to figure out what to do. My boss sighed but agreed, and I hung up the phone with a shaky breath, staring at the peeling paint on the wall as if it might offer an answer. I thought about packing again, about running the way I'd done before, about disappearing into another city with a new name, new address, new lie, but somewhere deep inside I knew it wouldn't matter. Dante had already found me once. He could find me again. He had men, money, power, everything I didn't. And the cruelest truth of all was that he didn't even have to lift a finger. The fear of what he might do was already enough to break me. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a strange shade of silver, the kind that comes before rain, and I decided to take Leo for a walk, telling myself that maybe a little air would help me think, that maybe if I just kept moving I could stay one step ahead of the panic clawing at my chest. I tucked him into his stroller, wrapped him in his soft blue blanket, and stepped outside into the wind that smelled faintly of rain and exhaust. The streets were quiet, the city dulled by the coming storm, and for a while I almost let myself believe everything would be okay. Leo laughed at the pigeons, his tiny hands reaching for the sky, and for a few precious minutes the world felt normal again. I told him stories in a whisper, nonsense tales about clouds and colors, my voice light and calm even as my heart beat like a trapped bird in my chest. When I turned the corner onto Maple Street, I noticed the car, a sleek black sedan idling too quietly, windows tinted too dark. It wasn't parked like the others. It faced the wrong way, angled toward the sidewalk. My stomach twisted and instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, to vanish into the crowd that wasn't even there. But before I could move, before I could think, the car door opened. 2 men stepped out. They weren't dressed like thugs. They looked clean, professional, anonymous. The kind of men no one would notice until it was too late. The taller one smiled, a polite, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Lane?" he asked, and the sound of my fake last name made my blood run cold. I shook my head, my voice caught somewhere between fear and fury. "You have the wrong person." He nodded once, as if I'd said exactly what he expected, and in the next second everything happened too fast for me to process. The shorter one moved toward me, quick and silent, his hand reaching for the stroller. I screamed, loud, raw, instinctive, and pushed back, shoving the stroller away, clutching at Leo as panic exploded in my chest. But then something sharp pressed against my side, something cold, metallic, and final. And a voice whispered close to my ear, "Don't make a scene. He's safe as long as you cooperate." I froze. Every muscle in my body locked as I felt the press of the gun through my coat, the heat of his breath against my neck. I looked down at Leo, his wide, innocent eyes staring up at me, confused but calm, and in that moment I knew I couldn't fight. Not here. Not like this. They took him. They took my baby right there on the sidewalk while I stood frozen, my voice stolen, my heart ripped from my chest. The taller man lifted the stroller with the same care one might use for something fragile, and for a moment, I almost believed they wouldn't hurt him. I followed them, stumbling, begging, my voice breaking on every word, but they didn't look back. When the car door slammed shut and the engine roared to life, I pounded on the window until my hands ached, screaming his name, screaming Leo, screaming until my throat burned and the world blurred into streaks of rain and noise. The car pulled away, smooth and silent, disappearing around the corner before I could even see the license plate. And then there was nothing. Just the echo of my screams bouncing off empty buildings, the rain beginning to fall in heavy drops that soaked through my clothes, the wind swallowing my sobs. For a long time I didn't move. I just stood there in the middle of the street, my arms empty, my mind blank, except for one word, Dante. It had to be him. No one else could have done this. No one else would dare. When I finally stumbled back to the apartment, drenched and shaking, there was an envelope taped to the door. My hands trembled as I tore it open, my vision swimming through the blur of tears. Inside was a single piece of paper, thick and expensive, embossed with that same silver lettering that haunted me. Dante Moretti. Below it, written in his precise, elegant handwriting, were just 3 words. "He's safe. Come." And an address. I don't remember the cab ride there, only the sound of rain against the windows, the smell of leather, the steady hum of tires on wet asphalt. My mind played every possible outcome, every way this could go wrong, every reason I should turn back, but the truth was, there was no choice. He had Leo. And if I wanted my son back, I had to walk straight into the lion's den. When the gates opened, I saw the mansion for the first time. Massive, cold, beautiful in a way that made your stomach ache. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress. All sharp edges and silent guards and walls that looked like they'd seen too much. A man in a black suit opened my door, his expression blank, his eyes avoiding mine. He led me through the grand foyer, marble floors gleaming under the light of an enormous chandelier, the air smelling faintly of smoke and cedar and something darker underneath. Power. And then I saw him. Dante stood at the far end of the room, near a grand piano, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. In his arms he held Leo, my Leo, who was calm, even smiling, his small fingers gripping Dante's tie as if he'd known him forever. Something inside me broke. I ran forward half sobbing, but 2 guards stepped between us before I could reach him. Dante raised a hand, and they stopped. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and said softly, "You should have told me, Arya." "Give him back," I choked out. "He's not yours." He tilted his head, his eyes dark and unflinching. "You're wrong," he said. He's mine. And you're not leaving until I decide what happens next." The words hung in the air like a verdict, and for the first time I understood what real captivity felt like. Not chains, not cages, but the quiet certainty that the person holding your heart had already decided its fate. The first thing I learned about Dante's world was that silence was never empty. It was deliberate, crafted like everything else he touched, heavy with the kind of meaning that pressed down on your lungs until breathing felt like a privilege you had to earn. The mansion was quiet in that way, a vast cathedral of wealth and secrets, where every polished surface reflected a version of me I didn't recognize, a woman who no longer belonged to herself. He called it protection. I called it what it was: captivity. The morning after he took us, I woke up in a room that looked like something from a magazine. High ceilings, white curtains, gold trim, a bed so soft it felt like it could swallow me whole. But no amount of luxury could hide the truth. The door was locked from the outside. The windows opened to a garden that stretched far beyond the iron gates, watched by men who stood like statues. Even the air here smelled expensive, perfumed with roses and control. Leo was safe. That was the only thought keeping me from breaking completely. When I found him in the nursery Dante had prepared, my knees nearly gave out. The room was breathtaking. Soft blue walls, toys neatly arranged, sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains. It was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't love. It was ownership dressed as kindness. He had done all of this for his son, for the blood that carried his name. But for me there was no illusion. I was a guest in a gilded prison, a trespasser in the kingdom of a man who believed he had every right to rewrite the terms of my existence. When Dante entered the room that first morning, I didn't turn to face him. I stood by the crib, one hand resting on Leo's back, feeling the gentle rhythm of his breathing. I could sense Dante behind me, still, composed, his presence larger than the space itself. "You slept," he said softly, his voice smooth, almost gentle. But there was something in it that coiled tight, something possessive and unyielding. "I didn't have much of a choice," I replied, my tone brittle, each word trembling on the edge of defiance. The door was locked. He was silent for a moment, and then I heard his footsteps approach, slow and deliberate. "You're safe here," he said finally, and the absurdity of it almost made me laugh. "Safe?" I turned then, my voice rising, the fear in me sparking into anger. "You took my child from me, brought us here like some prize you won, and you dare tell me I'm safe?" His eyes didn't flicker, not once. "Safer than you were out there," he said. "There are people who would use you to hurt me. You're here because I won't let that happen." "That's not protection," I whispered. "That's control." He tilted his head slightly, studying me with that unnerving calm, the kind that made you wonder what storms were hidden beneath the surface. "Maybe they're the same thing," he said. I wanted to hate him, and I did, with a clarity that burned. But there was something else, something infuriating and dangerous, something that came from the way he looked at Leo, from the quiet reverence that softened his features when he reached into the crib and brushed a hand over his son's hair. For a man who had built an empire on fear, he looked fragile in that moment, undone, uncertain, human. "Does he laugh?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. I hesitated, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his tone. "Sometimes," I said softly. "He laughs when I sing." His eyes met mine then, and there was a question there, something unspoken and aching. "Sing for him," he said. I stared at him, stunned. "What?" "Sing," he repeated, his voice lower now, his expression unreadable. "I want to hear him laugh." It was absurd, and yet the command wasn't cruel. It was almost pleading. I hesitated, but when I looked down at Leo, his bright eyes watching both of us, I couldn't refuse him. So I began to sing, softly, the way I always did at home, a lullaby my mother used to hum when the world was still kind. My voice was shaky at first, but as the melody filled the room, Leo smiled, then laughed, a bright, perfect sound that broke something open inside me. And then I heard it. Dante's breath catching. When I looked up, his expression was raw, unguarded, the mask slipping just enough for me to glimpse the man beneath the monster. He looked at Leo like he was witnessing something holy, something he'd never believed he deserved. "He has your laugh," he said, his voice quiet, roughened by something I couldn't name. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because for a single, fleeting second, I saw what could have been. A life untainted by violence, a man capable of love, a home that wasn't built on fear. But dreams like that weren't made for people like me. Later, after he left, I wandered through the halls of his mansion, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Everywhere I turned, there were cameras, guards, eyes that followed. The windows were barred with glass thick enough to stop a bullet. The gates locked by code, the phones disconnected. It was beautiful, yes, but in that beauty was cruelty. Every flower in the garden, every shimmer of marble, every painting on the wall was another reminder that I wasn't free. Days passed like that. Quiet, calculated days, where time moved differently. Dante worked during the day, or pretended to. I'd see him sometimes through the window, standing by the balcony on the phone, his tone low and sharp, his posture one of absolute command. The men who came and went bowed their heads when they spoke to him, their respect tinged with fear. But at night, he'd find excuses to see Leo, to check on him, to hold him, to sit in the nursery and just watch him sleep. I told myself it was just guilt, some twisted attempt to reclaim lost time. But there was something else in his eyes, something deeper, as if the presence of this small, innocent child had cracked open a part of him that had been locked away for too long. One night, I found him in the nursery again, long after midnight. He didn't hear me come in at first. He was sitting in the rocking chair, Leo asleep against his chest, the moonlight soft on both their faces. He was humming, low, rough, off-key. And the sight of it, this man who could end lives with a word, reduced to silence by a child's breath, made something inside me twist painfully. "You shouldn't be here," I said quietly, but my voice lacked conviction. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine in the half-light. "Neither should you," he murmured. "But here we are." I crossed my arms, needing distance, needing air. "You can't keep us here forever, Dante." He studied me for a long time, then stood slowly, laying Leo back in the crib with a tenderness that stole my breath. When he turned back to me, his face was shadowed, unreadable. "I don't plan to," he said. Something in his tone made my heart stutter. "Then what do you plan?" He stepped closer, so close I could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the faint trace of whiskey and cedar that clung to his skin. His gaze dropped to my mouth before lifting again, his voice low, dangerous in its calmness. "I plan," he said slowly, "to make you see that you belong here. With me. With him." I shook my head, but my body betrayed me. A tremor, a breath, a pull I didn't want to feel. "You're insane," I whispered. He smiled then, not cruelly, but like a man who knew the truth long before I dared speak it. "No, Arya," he said, "just patient." And when he brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering for a fraction too long, I realized with a shuddering clarity that patience was far more dangerous than madness. Because patience meant he wouldn't stop. Not until I gave in. Time began to lose its meaning inside Dante's mansion, dissolving into a blur of days that bled into nights, marked only by the slow rhythm of Leo's breathing and the soft echo of footsteps that haunted the corridors. Morning light would spill across the marble floors like gold. But it never felt warm. It was beauty without comfort. A kind of perfection that didn't invite you in, but warned you to stay still. I tried to count the days since I had last seen the world beyond those gates. But the truth was that counting only made the walls feel closer. And so I stopped. And yet, somewhere between the silence and the fear, something began to shift. Not in the house, not in Dante, but in me. It happened slowly, in small, treacherous ways. The way he'd pause when he passed Leo's door to listen for the soft sounds of his laughter, or the quiet, careful way he'd ask if I had eaten when he came home late from whatever bloody empire he ruled. I told myself it was manipulation, that men like him didn't know kindness, only strategy. But the lies I told myself began to sound like prayers whispered by someone who already knew they wouldn't be answered. One evening, the rain came, heavy and relentless. A storm that drummed against the glass and drowned the city in sound. I was sitting by the window in my room, the same room I still refused to call mine, tracing the patterns of water on the pane while Leo slept in the crib beside me, when there was a soft knock at the door. I didn't need to ask who it was. He didn't wait for permission before stepping inside. He never did. Dante stood there, half shadow, half man, wearing a black shirt that clung to the lines of his body, his hair damp from the rain, his eyes darker than the storm behind him. He said nothing at first, only looked around the room as if searching for something invisible, his gaze lingering on the sleeping child before it found me. "I didn't mean to wake him," he said quietly, though there was something in his voice that told me he hadn't come to see Leo tonight. "You didn't," I murmured, turning back to the window, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of my attention. "You always come here uninvited." He stepped closer, his reflection merging with mine in the glass. "If I asked, would you say yes?" I hated the way the question caught me off guard, the way it made my breath falter because the truth wasn't simple, and he knew it. I looked at him then, at the faint bruise near his jaw, the smear of blood just below his sleeve that he hadn't bothered to hide, and I felt that familiar clash of revulsion and curiosity, of fear and something far more dangerous. "You're hurt," I said, my voice soft but sharp with accusation. "Who did you kill this time?" He gave a low laugh, not amused, more like the sound of a man who had forgotten how to feel anything lighter. "Not kill," he said. "Remind." "Remind who?" "That the Moretti name still means something." He walked closer, stopping just behind me, his reflection towering over mine in the window. "You don't want to know more than that." "You're right," I whispered. "I don't." But part of me did. Part of me always did. For a long time we stood there in silence, the air thick with things unspoken. I could feel the heat of him behind me. Too close. Too steady. And I hated how my body noticed. How it remembered, the way his touch once felt before I knew who he was, before fear became the language between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, different somehow. "Do you ever wonder why I am like this?" The question startled me. I turned and his face was unreadable, calm, composed, but in his eyes there was a shadow, something restless and searching. "No," I said, though it was a lie. "I don't care." "You should," he murmured, "because you and Leo are part of it now." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he could cage us, but he couldn't make us part of his darkness. But when he stepped closer, the scent of rain and smoke surrounding him, I couldn't move, couldn't look away. "I grew up in this house," he said after a moment, his voice distant, as if he were speaking to the ghosts that lingered here. "Every wall in this place has heard someone scream. My father believed pain was the only way to teach loyalty. My mother, she believed silence was the only way to survive." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window where the rain fell harder, streaking down the glass like tears the world refused to shed. I learned both lessons well. Something twisted in my chest. Pity, horror, something in between. I had never imagined him as a child, never thought of him as anything but what he was now. Power and danger wrapped in flesh. To picture him small, scared, waiting for the next bruise or betrayal. It didn't make him innocent, but it made him real. And that was somehow worse. "Is that your excuse?" I asked quietly. "That they broke you first, so now you get to break others?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't look angry. He looked tired. "It's not an excuse, it's the truth. But maybe it doesn't matter, because the result is the same." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain filled the silence, the rhythm of it like a confession no one wanted to make. "You shouldn't tell me these things," I whispered finally. "You want me to hate you. Remember?" He smiled faintly, a bitter curve of his mouth. "I thought so. But lately—" He trailed off, stepping closer until the distance between us disappeared, his breath warm against my skin. "Lately, I'm not so sure what I want you to feel." The air changed, heavy, electric, charged with something that felt like danger dressed as desire. His hand rose, slow and deliberate, and for a heartbeat I thought he might touch me. Instead, he stopped just short, his fingers hovering near my face, trembling slightly in a way that betrayed something he didn't want me to see. "Don't," I whispered, though I didn't move away. He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening, and when he spoke, his voice was raw. "You think I don't know what I am? You think I don't see what this does to you? Then stop," I said, my voice cracking. "Let me go." His eyes opened, sharp and bright with something like anguish. "I can't. Can't or won't." He exhaled slowly, and for a moment I saw it. The weight he carried, the violence stitched into his veins, the constant war between the man he wanted to be and the monster he became instead. "Both," he said finally. When he turned to leave, the tension broke like glass. He paused by the door, his hand on the frame, and said quietly without looking back, "Tomorrow, I'll show you something. Maybe then you'll understand." The door closed softly behind him, and I stood there for a long time, staring at the reflection he'd left in the window. A man made of shadows and regrets. A man who could destroy everything he touched, and yet somehow made me want to understand him anyway. That night, I dreamed of him. Not the man who took my freedom, but the boy who once learned pain before he learned love, who grew up behind walls that smelled like fear. I woke with tears on my cheeks and hated myself for them, because pity was the first step toward forgiveness, and forgiveness was a luxury I couldn't afford. The next day, he kept his promise. He took me down a long corridor I had never walked before, past guards who bowed their heads, past doors I wasn't allowed to open, until we reached a room lined with old photographs. His family, his past, his ghosts. He stood before a single picture, one I couldn't look away from. A woman with eyes too much like his, holding a small boy in her arms. "My mother," he said quietly. "She died when I was 7. My father made sure I remembered why." And for the first time since I met him, I saw Dante Moretti break. Not with tears or violence, but with silence. A silence that trembled, a silence that begged to be seen. In that moment, I should have felt nothing but hatred. But I didn't. And that terrified me more than anything else. The days that followed blurred into one another like ink bleeding into water, impossible to separate, impossible to contain. And yet underneath the quiet rhythm of routine, I could feel something shifting. Something fragile and unnamed, trembling at the edge of collapse. I didn't know when exactly I stopped counting the locks on the doors, or how many times I told myself I hated him, and didn't believe it. But I knew that something dangerous had taken root between us. something that felt too much like understanding, and far too much like surrender. Dante had kept his distance since the night he showed me that photograph of his mother, and for a while I thought maybe that distance would save me, that the space between us would harden again into the cold barrier I needed to survive. But I was wrong. Because every time I saw him, every time his hand brushed Leo's tiny head, or his voice softened just slightly when he spoke to me, the walls I'd built cracked a little more. It wasn't love. At least that's what I told myself. It was proximity, confusion, the twisted intimacy of captivity. A woman locked away, long enough to mistake the hand that feeds her for mercy. But late at night, when the house fell silent and the darkness pressed against the windows, I thought about the way his voice sounded when he said my name, and the thought scared me more than the man himself ever could. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of whispers. Low, hurried conversations I wasn't meant to hear, carried down the marble halls like ghosts looking for an ear to haunt. The guards spoke in code, but even through the walls I caught fragments. Shipment, double cross, payment due, and once, when they thought no one was listening, I heard Dante's name spoken in fear instead of reverence. It was a Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday, when I found him in the study, standing before the fireplace with his back to me, his hand resting on the mantel, his posture rigid. Papers were scattered across the desk. Maps, photographs, ledgers filled with names and numbers that looked like debts written in blood. The firelight caught the edge of his face, painting him in bronze and shadow. And for a moment I just watched him, trying to reconcile the man who held my son like something sacred with the one who could end lives without blinking. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, without turning around. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a tightness that made my stomach twist. "I heard shouting," I said, stepping closer. You thought something happened to me?" He turned then, and though the corner of his mouth curved upward, it wasn't a smile. "How touching." "Don't do that," I said quietly. "Don't make it a joke." He looked at me for a long time, the firelight flickering in his eyes, and then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's nothing you need to worry about." "Everything in this house is something I need to worry about," I said, the frustration rising before I could stop it. "You keep pretending I don't exist when it suits you, and then remind me I'm yours when it doesn't. Which is it, Dante? What am I to you?" He moved so quickly I barely had time to react. One moment he was across the room, the next he was standing inches away, his hand gripping my chin, forcing me to look up at him. His eyes burned, not with rage, but with something worse. Desperation. "You're what I can't seem to let go of," he said, his voice low, roughened by truth. "And that terrifies me more than anything else." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. I could feel the heat of him, the scent of whiskey and gunpowder and rain clinging to his skin. And for the first time, I saw him not as the monster who'd taken everything from me, but as the man who'd been broken by the things he couldn't control. I wanted to tell him to stop, to let me go, to say anything that would shatter the moment before it became something else entirely. But then his mouth was on mine, and all the reasons I had for hating him fell apart. The kiss wasn't gentle, it wasn't tender. It was a collision, a confession made in heat and hunger, in the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. I felt his hand at the back of my neck, the other at my waist, holding me like I might disappear if he let go. And for one terrible, beautiful second, I didn't want to. When he finally pulled away, his breathing was uneven, his gaze searching mine for something neither of us could name. "This is wrong," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I know," he said, "but I've never been good at doing what's right." I turned away before he could see the tears burning in my eyes, but before I could speak, the door burst open. It was Marco, one of his lieutenants, the one with eyes too sharp, and a smirk that never reached them. His expression when he saw us was a flash of surprise quickly buried beneath professionalism. "Boss," he said, glancing briefly at me before continuing, "we have a problem?" Dante straightened, the softness from moments ago vanishing like smoke. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that bleeds," Marco said, and for the first time I heard fear in his voice. They left without another word. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the distant sounds of shouting, doors slamming, the muffled thud of something heavy hitting the floor. When silence finally returned, it wasn't peace. It was the silence of aftermath. The next morning, the mansion was different. The guards were tense, their eyes darting to shadows that hadn't been there before. Dante didn't come to breakfast, didn't appear in the nursery, didn't send anyone to speak to me. The air felt charged, restless, like the house itself knew something terrible had shifted. By afternoon, I couldn't stand it anymore. I followed the sound of raised voices down the corridor, past the grand staircase, until I reached the study again. The door was half open, and what I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. Dante stood over Marco, who was on his knees, his face bruised and bleeding, a gun pressed against his forehead. "You sold us out," Dante said, his voice calm but deadly. "You gave them my roots, my men. You betrayed me." Marco spat blood onto the floor. "You've gone soft," he said. "Because of her, because of the kid. Everyone knows it. You're slipping, boss." Dante's hand didn't waver. His expression didn't change. But his eyes, God, his eyes were pure fury. "Get out," I said before I could stop myself. Both men turned, startled, as if they'd forgotten I could exist in their world. Dante's expression darkened. "Aria," he said slowly, warningly, "go upstairs." But I didn't move. I couldn't. "He's right," I whispered. "You're not the same, and maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's the first real thing about you." Something flickered across his face then. Doubt, hesitation, something fragile that didn't belong in a man like him. And in that heartbeat of weakness, Marco moved. There was a flash, a gunshot, the sharp metallic scent of blood filling the air. When the smoke cleared, Dante was still standing. Marco wasn't. The silence that followed was unbearable. Dante lowered the gun slowly, his hand trembling just enough for me to notice, and then he looked at me. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with something that looked too much like regret. "This," he said quietly, his voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before, "is what happens when you love something in my world." He turned away before I could speak, the gun still in his hand, his steps echoing down the hall like a dirge. And as I stood there staring at the blood spreading across the marble floor, I realized the most terrifying part wasn't what he'd done. It was that I still wanted to follow him. The night Marco died, the world inside the mansion changed. It wasn't something you could see at first glance. The walls were still immaculate. The guards still stood where they always had. The roses in the garden still open to the sun as if nothing beneath them had bled. But there was a heaviness in the air, a kind of stillness that spoke of endings. The Moretti men moved quieter now, their voices lower, their glances sharper, and even the servants walked as if afraid the floor itself might remember too much. I told myself I should hate him more than ever, that what I'd witnessed should have erased every flicker of weakness inside me. But the truth was that the sound of that gunshot haunted me less than the silence that followed it. The silence that came from knowing Dante hadn't wanted to pull the trigger, that he'd done it not for power or vengeance, but for survival, for control, for the same brutal instinct that had been carved into him long before I ever knew his name. For days he didn't speak to me. He shut himself away in his office, surrounded by men who came and went at all hours, voices rising and falling behind closed doors. Sometimes I caught fragments of words. Shipment, revenge, blood, debt. And though I didn't understand their full meaning, I could feel what they carried. A reckoning was coming, and it was already too late to stop it. Leo was the only thing that kept me tethered. He laughed and babbled and reached for my face with those tiny hands that didn't know what the world could take away. I told myself that as long as he was safe, I could endure anything, even the loneliness that came from living in the same house as the man who had taken my freedom, and yet somehow, against all reason, held my heart hostage too. It was a Thursday when everything broke. I remember the sky that morning, clear, endless blue, the kind of beauty that feels like a lie. Dante had left early, saying something about settling accounts. And though his voice was calm, his eyes weren't. They were the eyes of a man who had already accepted that something irreversible was about to happen. I spent the day in the garden with Leo, sitting under the shade of a magnolia tree, trying to pretend that the air didn't feel charged, that the guards positioned around us were there for comfort and not surveillance. I remember Leo's laughter echoing across the courtyard, his chubby hands grabbing at the petals that fell around him. And for one suspended heartbeat, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. One where this was all we had, just the two of us. No bloodlines, no ghosts, no debts to pay. But peace, I've learned, doesn't last in Dante's world. The first scream came from the gate. Then the sound of gunfire, sharp, metallic, terrifyingly close. The guards reacted instantly, shouting orders, drawing weapons, their voices drowned out by the chaos that tore through the air. I froze for a second too long, the kind of paralysis that only happens when reality shatters faster than your mind can process it. And then I grabbed Leo, holding him against me as I ran for the house. "Inside," one of the men shouted, his face pale, his gun raised. "Go!" I ran, the sound of bullets slicing through the air behind me, the world narrowing to the pounding of my heart and the weight of Leo in my arms. The front door burst open, and another guard grabbed me by the arm, dragging us through the foyer toward the stairs, shouting something about the panic room, about safety, about how the boss will handle it. But before we reached the hallway, the world exploded. The glass doors shattered inward, the roar of an engine outside, and then figures in black flooded the entryway, masked and armed, moving with brutal precision. I screamed, instinctively clutching Leo tighter, trying to turn, to run, but a hand grabbed me from behind, rough, gloved, merciless. I struggled, kicked, screamed until my throat tore, but it didn't matter. There were too many of them, too fast, too trained. "Don't hurt her," one of them barked, a voice I didn't recognize, sharp and cold. "Just take the kid." Those words split me open. I fought like I never had before, clawing, biting, the kind of madness only a mother knows, but one of them struck me hard across the face, and the world tilted, blurred. I fell to my knees, disoriented, Leo screaming somewhere above me, his cry so raw it tore through the chaos like a knife. And then, silence. When I looked up, they were gone. The car outside screeched away, the echo of its tires fading into the distance, leaving behind nothing but broken glass, blood on the floor, and the sound of my own voice screaming his name. "Leo!" I don't remember how long I screamed. I only remember the moment Dante burst through the doorway, blood on his hands, fury in his eyes, his men trailing behind him. He stopped when he saw me. The wreckage, the shattered door, the empty space where our son had been. For the first time since I'd met him, Dante Moretti looked afraid. "They took him," I sobbed, clutching at him, my words barely forming. "They took our baby." He caught me before I collapsed, his arms strong but shaking, his face ghost pale beneath the smear of dirt and blood. "Who?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Who did this?" "I don't know," I cried. "They didn't say—" He turned to one of his men, barking orders that blurred into noise. "Find them, every one of them. I don't care what it takes." And then he was gone again, storming toward the cars outside, leaving me on the marble floor with nothing but the echo of his voice and the hollow ache in my chest where my son's warmth had been. That night was endless. I paced the halls until my feet bled, waiting for news that never came, listening to the distant hum of engines, the occasional bark of an order, the sound of a war that had already begun. The house that had once been a cage now felt like a tomb, each room echoing with the absence of laughter, each breath I took heavier than the last. When Dante finally returned, it was nearly dawn. His suit was torn, his knuckles raw, his face bruised, but his eyes were alive with fire. "I know who has him," he said, his voice low, ragged with exhaustion. "It's Vitale." The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it, the venom, the grief, told me it meant everything to him. "He was my father's man," Dante said, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I spared him once. He thinks I'm weak. He wants to remind me what mercy costs." I stood there trembling, my voice barely a whisper. "Then let's go. Let's get him back." He stopped, his gaze snapping to mine. And for a heartbeat, I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, maybe even admiration. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said quietly. "You don't know what it will take." "I don't care," I said. "He's my son. Our son." Something in him broke then. He crossed the space between us, his hand cupping the back of my neck, his forehead resting against mine. "You shouldn't be part of this world," he whispered. "You never should have been." "Then take me out of it," I said, my voice trembling, "but not without him." He pulled back, his eyes burning with something fierce and dark. "You understand what happens if we do this? If I go after Vitale, there will be no forgiveness, no peace. It means war." "Then let there be war," I said, and though my voice cracked, I meant every word. He looked at me for a long time, and then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, the kind of nod that seals a fate. "Then we go tonight." And as the first light of morning crept across the sky, I realized that the fear I felt wasn't of dying. It was of living long enough to see what love had turned me into. I don't remember how many hours passed between Dante's promise and the moment we left. Only that time seemed to stretch and twist until it stopped belonging to me altogether, dissolving into the steady rhythm of engines, the metallic scent of gun oil, and the thud of my own heartbeat echoing through the vast, suffocating quiet of anticipation. The house that once held me captive now felt like a living thing about to exhale its last breath, every corridor humming with men readying for war, their faces blank, their eyes already halfway to the grave. And through it all, Dante moved like a shadow given purpose, silent, precise, coldly determined. A man no longer fighting for control, but for blood, for redemption, for something he had already decided he didn't deserve. I should have been afraid. But fear had become useless to me. Something I'd worn too long, like a coat that no longer kept out the cold. What I felt instead was an emptiness so deep it burned. A hollow made of too many unshed tears, and too many words that could no longer matter. Leo's absence was a wound that wouldn't clot, an ache that breathed with every heartbeat. The sound of his laugh, the warmth of his small hand in mine. They had become ghosts that followed me wherever I turned, haunting even the quiet spaces between my thoughts. Dante had told me I shouldn't come, that his world was no place for me, that what he was about to do would change everything forever. But I had looked at him with a calm I didn't recognize, the calm of someone who has already lost everything. "You can't protect me from this," I'd said. And maybe that was the first time he really saw me. Not the frightened girl he'd taken, not the broken woman he'd tried to own, but someone who could stand beside him in the fire without flinching. We drove through the night in a convoy of black cars that looked like ghosts sliding through the city, engines whispering, headlights cutting pale paths through the rain-slick streets. Dante sat beside me in the back seat, silent, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, the veins in his wrists pale and sharp against his skin. He didn't look at me, but I could feel the tension rolling off him, that quiet violence that lived just beneath the surface, waiting for permission to be unleashed. When we reached the warehouse, Vitale's stronghold, dawn was a smear of gray against the horizon, heavy and bruised. The air smelled of rust and gunpowder and something darker, the scent of inevitability. Dante's men spread out with military precision, their weapons raised, their movements efficient, almost beautiful in their ruthlessness. I followed Dante, the weight of the pistol he'd given me cold against my palm, my fingers trembling not from fear but from the sheer wrongness of it, the surreal horror of realizing I could kill if it meant getting my son back. He stopped before a steel door, turning to me for the first time since we'd left the mansion. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low, roughened by exhaustion and something that sounded like guilt. "If anything happens, you run. You don't look back." "I'm not running," I whispered, and though he didn't smile, his eyes softened for the briefest moment, a flicker of something human in the storm. Then he nodded once and kicked the door open. The chaos that followed was not like the movies. It was louder, messier, crueler. The air filled with the sound of bullets, of shouting, of metal striking metal, of men falling and not getting up again. I stayed close to Dante, too close, the world narrowing to the space between us, to the flashes of light that tore through the dark. Somewhere above the noise, I thought I heard Leo cry, a small piercing sound that cut through everything else, and I ran before Dante could stop me. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I followed the sound down a narrow hallway lined with doors, each one darker than the last, until I found one that wasn't locked. Inside, the room smelled of sweat and gasoline, and in the corner, under the faint flicker of a single light bulb, was Leo, small, terrified, but alive. When he saw me, he reached for me, his sob catching in his throat, and I fell to my knees, pulling him into my arms, burying my face in his hair, my entire body shaking with relief so violent it felt like pain. "It's okay," I whispered over and over, though I wasn't sure it was true. "It's okay, baby. I've got you. I've got you." But the relief didn't last, because behind me the door opened, and standing there, his gun raised, his eyes cold and empty, was Vitale. He looked older than Dante, broader, his face scarred and expressionless. But his smile, that was the kind of smile you only saw in men who enjoyed what they did. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm, almost polite. "But I suppose you've always been his weakness." I turned, shielding Leo with my body, the gun in my hand shaking, my finger pressed against the trigger, though I didn't know if I could pull it. He laughed, soft, cruel. "Do you even know what you're holding?" And then Dante's voice cut through the air like thunder. "Put it down, Vitale." I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his gun trained, his expression carved from stone. For a moment, everything froze. 3 hearts beating in the same room, 3 lives hanging by the same thread. Vitale smiled wider. "You came yourself. I didn't think you had it in you anymore." "I came for my son," Dante said, stepping forward, his voice low but shaking. "You made this personal. Now it ends with you." They moved at the same time. The shots were deafening, flashes of light exploding in the dark. I screamed, clutching Leo, my vision blurring as the room filled with smoke and dust. When the noise finally stopped, the silence that followed was unbearable. Vitale lay on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, his gun still, clutched in his hand. But Dante was down too. He was on his knees, one hand pressed against his side, blood seeping through his fingers, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. I dropped the gun and ran to him, Leo clinging to my shoulder, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear myself breathe. "No, no, no," I whispered, my hands shaking as I pressed against the wound, feeling the warmth of his blood under my fingers. "Stay with me, Dante, please." He tried to speak, his breath ragged, his voice breaking around the words. "You're safe," he said, his hand reaching for mine. "He's safe. That's all that matters." "Don't you dare," I cried, the words tearing from my throat. "Don't you dare say goodbye." He smiled faintly, that same small, impossible smile that had always been half sorrow, half confession. "I told you once," he whispered, his eyes fluttering. "You ruined my peace, Arya." "Then let me ruin everything," I said, pressing harder against the wound, my tears mixing with his blood. "Just don't leave me." The sound of sirens in the distance broke through the quiet. Faint at first, then closer, louder, relentless. Dante's men were shouting outside, their voices blurred by the echo of chaos. I looked down at him, my heart breaking under the weight of what I saw in his eyes. The acceptance, the exhaustion, the terrible peace of a man who had finally reached the end of his war. "No," I whispered again, shaking my head, refusing to believe it. "We're not done. Do you hear me? We're not done." He looked at Leo, at the small, tear-streaked face peeking from my shoulder, and something soft flickered in his gaze. Love, pure and unguarded, the kind of love he'd never allowed himself to show until now. "Tell him," he began, but his voice cracked, his hand slipping from mine, his body sagging against the cold floor. "Dante," I gasped, shaking him, my voice breaking. "Dante, please." His eyes closed. The sirens grew louder. And for a moment I thought the world had stopped, until the sound of footsteps echoed behind me, and a familiar voice, low and cold, said my name. "Arya." I turned slowly, still kneeling beside Dante, and when I saw who stood in the doorway, the one man I thought was dead, the one Dante himself had buried years ago, my blood turned to ice. "Hello, little sister," he said, his gun gleaming under the broken light. For a long, breathless moment I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even feel the weight of Leo in my arms, because the voice that spoke my name belonged to a ghost, a shadow from another life, a memory I had buried so deep that even my grief had forgotten where it was hidden. The sound of it, low, calm, cold, cut through me like a blade carved from every secret I'd ever tried to keep. My brother. Julian. He stepped into the room as if he had never left it, his eyes dark and sharp and full, of a kind of cruel calm that only people who have seen the worst parts of humanity can wear like a second skin. His suit was immaculate, his hands steady, and yet there was something in his gaze that made my heart twist. A hollow grief that mirrored my own, a grief that had grown teeth. "Still protecting monsters, Arya?" he said softly, almost tenderly, though the gun in his hand made a liar of his tone. "You always did have a weakness for broken things." I swallowed hard, my voice trembling when I spoke. "He saved me," I whispered. "He saved our son." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Our son," he repeated, and the words landed between us like a warning, like the world shifting on its axis. "Julian, please," I said, my voice cracking. "Not here, not like this." But he wasn't listening. His gaze had already drifted to Dante, still lying on the floor, his blood spreading across the concrete like a dark halo. His breath shallow but still there, faint, defiant, alive. "This is the man who ruined our family," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. "The man who killed our father." The world tilted. "No," I breathed. "That's not—" "He didn't tell you?" Julian's laugh was soft, disbelieving. "Of course he didn't. The truth is never convenient for men like him." I looked down at Dante, his eyes half open now, his hand twitching as he tried to reach for me. "Arya," he whispered, his voice ragged, heavy with the weight of too many unsaid things. Don't listen to him. But the words were too late. The past was already unraveling before me, thread by thread. Julian stepped closer, the gun steady in his hand. He killed our father in this very city, he said, each word deliberate, cruelly precise. He was still climbing his way up the ladder then, just another soldier with a hunger for power. My father trusted him, loved him like a son. And how did he repay him? A bullet in the back. My throat tightened, the edges of my vision blurring. No, I whispered, shaking my head, though part of me already knew it was true. I'd seen it in Dante's silences, in the guilt that lingered in his eyes whenever he spoke of the past, in the way his voice changed when I asked about the things that had made him this way. Dante coughed, his breath hitching. It wasn't like that, he managed, his hand curling weakly around mine. Your father was going to kill me. It was him or me. I tried to walk away, Arya. I swear I did. Julian's voice was sharp as glass. And now you think she'll forgive you because you've built her a golden cage? Dante's eyes met mine then, and what I saw in them wasn't denial. It was pain, and love, and a terrible, quiet acceptance. I never asked for forgiveness, he whispered, only the chance to keep you safe. The room felt too small, too full of ghosts. The air was thick with gunpowder and grief, with the kind of history that bleeds through generations until it poisons everyone it touches. I looked at Julian, at the brother who had vanished into the dark years ago, the brother who had once held my hand as a child and promised me we would survive anything as long as we stayed together. I looked at Dante, the man who had taken everything from me and somehow given me back a piece of my soul in return. And for the first time I understood that I was standing at the center of their war, the same war that had begun long before I was born, a war that would not end until one of them stopped breathing. Put it down, I said, my voice low but steady, even as tears burned in my eyes. Julian, please, this isn't you. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. You don't know who I am anymore, sister. Then let me remind you, I said, stepping forward, Leo still clutched against my chest. You're the one who used to carry me when the thunder scared me. The one who used to steal bread so I wouldn't go hungry. You're not a killer. Maybe not then, he said, his voice breaking for the first time. But you didn't see what he did to us, Arya. You didn't see what came after. The Morettis burned everything. Behind me, Dante stirred, forcing himself upright with a sound that tore through me like a cry. If you want revenge, he said hoarsely, then take it, but don't make her live with another ghost. For a second, Julian hesitated, the briefest flicker of doubt in his expression, but then he raised the gun again. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just moved. The shot echoed through the room like thunder. For a moment, I couldn't tell who had fired. My ears rang, my vision swam, and then I saw Julian stagger backward, his gun clattering to the floor, his hand clutching his side where blood bloomed through his shirt like a spreading flower. He looked at me, not with anger, not even surprise, but with something like sorrow, and then he fell. The gun in my hand felt impossibly heavy. I dropped it, my knees giving way as I fell beside him, the tears spilling freely now, unstoppable. I didn't mean... I started, but the words broke apart in my throat. Julian's hand found mine, weak but warm. You always had to save everyone, he whispered, his breath shallow, even when it meant saving the wrong one. Don't talk like that, I sobbed. Please don't. But his eyes were already distant, his hand slipping from mine, his body going still. The silence that followed was unbearable. I turned toward Dante, my face wet with tears, my heart splitting open under the weight of what I had done, what I had lost, what I had chosen. He was watching me, his expression raw, unreadable, as if he couldn't decide whether to thank me or curse me. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost reverent. "You saved me," he said. "No," I whispered. "I damned us both." He reached for me then, his hand trembling, blood still seeping from his side. I went to him, still clutching Leo, still shaking, still unsure whether I could forgive either of us. We sat there on the cold floor, surrounded by the wreckage of everything we had destroyed, the first light of morning filtering through the broken windows, painting the room in gold that felt too pure for people like us. "I don't know where we go from here," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes full of a strange, quiet peace. "Forward," he said. "Always forward." Outside, the sirens wailed again, closer this time, echoing through the dawn like a requiem. I held Leo tighter, pressing my face into his hair, breathing him in, reminding myself that there was still something innocent left in this world worth saving. And as I looked down at Dante, at the man who had broken me, loved me, haunted me, I realized that maybe redemption wasn't something you found in light, but something you built from the wreckage of the dark. Maybe love, the kind that survives ruin, isn't about forgiveness at all. Maybe it's about staying when every part of you wants to run. When the police came, I didn't resist. Dante didn't either. We were quiet, hand in hand, Leo asleep between us, as the dawn finally claimed the night. And in that fragile silence as they led us away, I knew this wasn't the end. It was something else entirely. Because some stories don't end when the gunfire stops. They end when the heart decides to keep beating anyway.